Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone. And now, here is your host, the lovely, delightful, insightful, and all-around great gal, Ms. Barbara DeLong.
I always have to smile when I hear that intro. I have Ken Quiethawk to thank for it, and he came out of retirement to record it for me, and it is a treasure that I will hold on to forever. He and his wife have a wonderful website, nativestorytellers.com, and they are both native storytellers, and they have preserved an old tradition that is slowly seeping out of consciousness in a lot of areas. Be a good idea to check into the website and listen to some of the old stories, because they have magic in them, and they certainly are able to bring a greater sense of spirit into one's life. Tonight I have an author that I am very excited about. I have Glenn Kreisberg here. He is a radio frequency engineer, writer, lecturer, licensed outdoor guide, and the former editor of Author of the Month page at grahamhancock.com. He serves as director at large for the New England Antiquities Research Association. He's the author of Lost Knowledge of the Ancients and Mysteries of the Ancient Past. He's the co-founder of the Overlook Mountain Center in Woodstock, New York. And his website is overlookmountain.org. You want to check it out. The book that we're going to be talking about tonight is called Spirits in Stone, The Secrets of Megalithic America. And all of you know that I am very personally involved in understanding the stone structures that are here, specifically in the Northeast, but they're all over the country. And, you know, as an educator who is retired, I am horrified to think that the true meaning of all of these structures isn't being taught in schools, isn't being spread out there so that the general public can have some idea as to the ancient antiquity that truly is here in this country. And Glenn, in his book, does a magnificent job of pointing that out as well. So welcome to the show, Glenn.
Thanks for having me, Barbara. It's great to be here.
Oh, I couldn't be more thrilled. It's really funny. 10, 20 years ago, I'm not sure that I would have been involved or interested, but for some reason, stones called to me. And though I'm not one who roughs it, I have trudged through woods and found chambers and picked ticks off people and dogs and all sorts of stuff, trying to find out more about the structures and everything. And of course, my focus was the stone chambers and the stone walls. And I saw the cairns, I saw the dolmens, and for some reason I was just so focused on, let's get to another chamber, let's see, if it's corbelled construction and the dried construction and everything. And your book, while it hits all of those, it really goes more deeply into, why they were constructed, how they were constructed, their purpose and their meaning, more so than anything else I've ever seen, because you seem to have a special affinity for them, so that there's great respect here, you can tell. So how did you, how were you drawn into this endeavor, which is absolutely encompassing, really? Usually when somebody gets involved in it, it's like you have a mission, and you're doing an amazing job of answering that call, for sure. So how did you get involved with the stone structures?
Well, it wasn't really a direct route. It was kind of circuitous. I got an interest in ancient history generally when I was a teenager, a young adult. I had the opportunity to work at an antiquarian bookstore in my hometown, a little store called Three Geese in Flight, which specialized in Celtic and Arthurian mythology and ancient cultures and Native American lore. So working there, I read a lot of really interesting books, and it kind of sparked my interest in ancient culture and ancient mythology. And then moving more closer to the present, probably about 15 years ago, in my day job as a radio frequency engineer, I was asked to sit on a siting committee for a cell tower here in our hometown of Woodstock, New York. And in the course of the site application process, there were some residents who spoke at a public hearing and talked about these stone piles that were near the site of the cell tower, and they wanted them to be investigated. And basically, they were all dismissed as nothing to see here, a dime a dozen colonial or early American stone walls or stone piles related to farming or agriculture, kind of the default bucket that all these sites are put into. And there was some pretty compelling evidence, and there were some folks from NERA who came and talked at the planning board hearing and described these things as being ancient and Native American and being found throughout the Northeast. And their testimony wasn't really considered because the expert testimony, the archaeologists and the state historians, they all basically dismissed this notion that they could be Native American. I should correct something that you said in the introduction. I am no longer a director at large at NERA, just a rank and file member of. And they're a wonderful organization. Anybody who's interested in this subject should look up NERA and get involved. So yeah, it was that public hearing that really sparked my interest, and then I spoke to some of the residents who lived near the site, and they took me to show me these stone piles, and I could tell that they were not related to stone quarrying, which took place up on Overlook Mountain, and that they were not related to early land subdivisions. I mean, it really sparked my interest in going and trying to research and find out what the heck they were and who was responsible for them, because I didn't buy the line that they were just all early American or colonial in origin, and that some of them might be, in fact, ancient and much more interesting.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that gets to me, the fact that if you look at stone chambers, stone walls, dolmens, the cairns, all of these are so much more ancient than the people in this area understand. That these are characteristics, these are forms that are all over the world, and in other parts of the world, they are credited with being thousands of years old. And yet in America, the powers that be tend to say, well, yeah, the Indians did that or the colonists did it. And if you took all of the stone structures that are in this country and you put them all together, you would find that North America has the greatest collection of stone monuments in the world. And
that's probably true, and it's not fully recognized, but that's probably accurate to say. And of course, if you want to consider all of North America, and you think about what you have going on in the Mississippi Valley and in the ancient cultures there, and in the Southwest, it's a tremendous amount of archaeological evidence that supports that they had this sophisticated view and construction techniques that aligned with the stars, but yet in the Northeast, no such view exists, and it's kind of the entrenched dogma that no Native Americans built in stone anywhere in the Northeast, and it's just simply not true, not supported by evidence if you do the research.
Well, I think the other thing too is in school that people are taught that the Native Americans that were here were just hunters and gatherers, and they were small bands, and the reality is that there were huge nations of Native American Indians here, and there are sites in this country that go back, excuse me, thousands of years, and to me it is such a sin to not educate the population into the fact that just like Egypt, we have these kind of sites. All right, they aren't pyramids, and you can't have, a great deal of tourist traffic and stuff like that. But the reality is, our country is so rich in a history that goes back thousands of years. Excuse me. The copper mines up in Michigan and Minnesota have been in production for 9,000 years. So
it is. It's astounding. We do a terrible injustice to the ancient populations going back as long as there have been populations here, whether that's 10, 15, 20,000 years. To say that there was no civilization during that period is it's almost ludicrous. And as you mentioned, and there are some who would dispute that the earthworks and that the constructions of the Mississippi Valley 5,000 years ago didn't rival what there was in Egypt as far as the constructed techniques. The scale of some of the mounds that were built in the Midwest were awesome. You're right, maybe not as big as the Great Pyramid, but rivaling it, and built within population centers that certainly rivaled anything anywhere on Earth at the time. It's a kind of a convenient untruth to say that there was no civilization here. It allowed the Europeans, when they arrived, to just take what they want, carte blanche, and not really have to consider that it belonged to anybody or that there was something here previous to them.
Oh, yeah. And you look at Monk's Mound, that was a huge city. I mean, there were cities here. They were, the Iroquois, I believe, had a nation that went all the way down almost into Mexico. I mean, it was a huge. There was an amazing culture here that textbooks don't give it credit for. And the other thing that really outrages me is that the textbooks really look upon the Indians as primitive, and they were so far from that. And it infuriates me that when the colonists invaded, and they invaded this land, they decided that the indigenous people were so barbaric they had to convert them to Christianity without taking the time to learn that they had a religion that was far superior to what they were trying to cram down their throats. They had an affinity with nature. They could read the earth energies. They were amazing people, and yet they were such a gentle people, really, even though they did kill people. But they were a gentle people, and so they were overwhelmed and overrun. And, of course, we gave them all the diseases that almost wiped them out, too. So we came close to destroying something that's very precious to us, and our history is important, because if you don't know your history, you don't have a foundation to build on.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. And unfortunately, the Dutch Calvinists that came to this region, New England or New York specifically, the European population in general was fed a pretty steady diet of propaganda that the natives were savages, that they were devil worshippers, that they killed and eat their baby. These dialogues from the church, the Jesuit relations, just paint the most horrible picture of the native population, and it's pretty much been shown to be propaganda tactics to turn the European populace against the indigenous population and go along with wiping them out. So it was a horrible thing that happened. The ones that weren't wiped out, as you say, by disease and by the views of the early colonists, were basically given the choice to assimilate, into the religion and behavior of the Europeans, or were rounded up and put into reservations and oppressed in that way to no end. So they really got a horribly raw deal. And it didn't necessarily start out that way. When the Europeans arrived, when they began to negotiate with the native civilizations that were here, it was a system that Europeans were fairly familiar with. You had clans, headed by chiefs, where tribes, had their, for lack of a better term, their prince and princesses married off to the other tribes' prince and princesses for alliances and peace alliances, trading alliances, and this type of negotiation and interaction wasn't foreign and was quite familiar to the Europeans, and they were able to get along quite well in many cases with the tribes. But that devolved as the Europeans became greedy, and as concepts like manifest destiny began to take hold. You had the deterioration of the equal partner in negotiating treaties, and suddenly it was our way or the highway approach by the Europeans, and the natives were terribly taken advantage of, left with very little, if not anything, of their culture. And there were efforts made to convolute the ancestry and the lineage of these tribes so that they could not be retained or recovered, and it's really a challenge these days.
Oh yeah, and I think what is so infuriating is that they, like you said, assume that they were barbaric and that they didn't have brains in their head, and to think that someone who is in the same generation as you doesn't have the same mental power as you really offends me. Everybody uses their intellect in a different way, and the Indians were so attuned to nature, to the nature energies, to keeping a balance in the environment, and they didn't kill unless they needed food, and then they thanked the animal for sacrificing its life for them. I mean, it was a gentle type of culture that and yes, they had wars and arguments too, but not the way we do today. And I think what really amazes me, especially about your book brings out such wonderful details of things that anybody who lives in the Northeast, especially the New York area, you've seen the walls and you've probably seen the chambers, and the cairns kind of have been hidden from view. They're there, but all you think is that they're a rock pile, and they're so much more than a rock pile. But they are stacked stones, and you want to explain a little bit about them, because I know a lot of people don't understand what they are or were or meant to be.
Well, I understand your dilemma with the chamber. The chambers are so fascinating; they can be all-consuming, and they're
yes.
and certainly a pile of stones is not as exciting as one of these awesome megalithic chambers. But I do get excited about the piles of stone. And what I did was I took a GIS approach to my methodology. I plotted the location of these stone piles in the woods, and the stone piles. You have to look at them, and you have to do the research about where they are and what they consist of, and whether they fall into which bucket and which pattern, and the patterns that are revealed kind of give away what these sites are. And one of the patterns we found when we plotted all these on the map and tried to start to connect the dots is that many of these sites have both line of sight and non-line of sight alignments on the azimuth with what would be the winter solstice sunrise, summer solstice sunset, and summer solstice sunrise, winter solstice sunset bearings. And this became very apparent once we took this GIS approach and we looked at a chart for the solstices that was provided by Curtis Hoffman, an archaeology professor at UMass. And he's been doing a lot of this research as well and establishing a pattern in his region, which is Massachusetts and Rhode Island and southern Vermont and New Hampshire, and seeing the same thing where these sites align with each other along this solstice bearing. And also a lot of them align east-west for equinox alignments for the sunrise and sunset. And we're also seeing a lot of these dolmens or large boulders that are set up, and I call them either compass stones or calendar stones, or in some cases both, in that they're oriented so that their prominent faces and points or noses of these boulders point and align with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, but they also align with one another, sometimes with line of sight along ridge tops and mountain tops, other times through valleys, kind of connecting the dots between the high points along these solstice sunrises and sunset azimuths. So, this is all verifiable with the compass in the field or with the protractor on the map on the computer. And you're able to see quite clearly that these sites do align, do fall into a pattern. And the pattern speaks to a sophistication and understanding, almost having a scientific understanding of the movements of the sky, of the sun, of the stars, and in many cases of the moon cycles as well, very important to Native American and Indigenous belief systems. So, the sophistication is there. The sophistication is there. What we see with the piles and the cairns and the dolmens on the ground, is evidence of this three-dimensional belief system, because everything they build on the surface relates in some way to the underworld through a connection to hydrologic features in water, or they're placed or built in places where springs and headwaters to important watercourses originate. And they're also connected to the sky, to the celestial world, through star maps and through the sunrise and sunset on the equinox and solstices. So this is that three-dimensional, sophisticated worldview or belief system that we find everywhere across the globe in civilizations, and we find it here with the native cultures in the Northeast in their spiritual beliefs dating back thousands of years.
Well, one thing that puzzles me, especially with the compass stones, well, and even the chambers, they didn't have a calendar. How did they determine the cardinals? I know the Indians would always, honor the different directions without calling it northeast, south, and west. How did they determine, first of all, the directions and then the equinoxes?
Well, I think they did it through keen observation and creating observation sites where they could study the sky and the movements and the positions of the sun and track it and plot it and memorialize it with these stone constructions. So I think this is evidence of how they determined it and how they preserved that knowledge. And you're right, some of the earliest ceremonies documented by the colonists when they arrived were, say, this tobacco ceremony where you would honor your ancestors, the grandmother and the grandfather, and associate it with the direction to the north or the south or the east or the west. And this was an important ceremony. And it also speaks to the importance of them understanding where those cardinal directions were and incorporating them into their spiritual belief system. And, they had, as you mentioned, a kind of a profound and intimate connection to nature and understood it in a way that, much more intuitively than we do now. We have to look at a calendar. We have to look at a watch. We have to use a GPS navigation to find someplace.
Yes.
Just a few years ago, we didn't have that, and now some people, they're like, how did I ever find any place? You had to look on a map and see where you were and see where you were going and get oriented. We've lost that because of technology, and calendars do the same thing. We just look on a sheet of paper on the wall and it tells us everything. Whereas in antiquity, it was a little more complicated, and you had to have that intuitive connection to nature to understand where you were in that cycle. That daily cycle, monthly, yearly, and even longer period cycles, like they're talked about in ancient Vedic scripture, like the Yugas or the Mayan Baktuns, and their calendars that were very, very precise. And whereas we have one calendar, the Mayans had 12 calendars.
Well, I know the North Star. I understand. It just seems so strange to me or difficult for me if you put me on a planet and I had to sort of figure out if it had seasons, if I had to figure out what the seasons were, I don't know how I would go about doing it. I don't know. I don't know what I would do. I think I would, hope that I could survive no matter what happened. But I don't think it, at least, of course, I don't have the same frame of reference as they did. But I'm not sure I would have looked to the sky for the stars to tell me the directions and things like that. I wanted to ask, a lot of the compass stones, are they on pathways, or, in other words, were these put on pathways where people normally, or there was traffic to them to see the sight line to another one or something like that, or are they just in the dense woods now?
Well, let me first go back to what you were saying about getting oriented on a planet, because that's kind of interesting. And what you said about the North Star is key, because the North Star, of course, is marking celestial north, and celestial north for us is the point in the sky where the Earth's axis is pointing. So once you can visualize the Earth as a sphere and having an axis passing through the middle and it pointing at a spot in the sky. Now you're starting to think about, okay, well, this sphere that I'm on has a north point and a south point, and understanding where those points are on that globe is going to be better understood by understanding where the axis is pointing to in the sky, because that point of celestial north is an orientation point. And when you have surveyors go out in the old school of surveying, the way they used to survey in the early 20th century, the very first thing they would do whenever they got a surveying job was go out at night and shoot Polaris, shoot the position of celestial north, because all of their readings would be taken off of that. And their readings would not be accurate unless they had that reference point. And so that's how every job would begin, by shooting celestial north. Now, in pre-literate cultures, and there's a wonderful book I always recommend called Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Sant'Elena and Hertha von Deutschen. They were both a couple of MIT scholars who wrote this book called Hamlet's Mill in the late 1960s. And their thesis was that the single biggest occupation with pre-literate cultures was the tracking of celestial north. And because the Earth is tilted on its axis and doesn't spin cleanly on its axis, but in fact wobbles, celestial north changes, and the star that marks it changes. Currently it's Polaris, but thousands of years ago it was the star Thuban, which is the third star in the tail of Draco, the serpent or the snake constellation. So I think there's a lot of clues there in how how ancient cultures got oriented and understood their place in the world and their world's place in the universe, and that that worldview began to develop. I don't think it happened quickly. I think it took many generations of human beings acting in consort, like working together to understand these features of the world they were in, these natural features. and then they were able to, kind of put together into a belief system and a worldview. Now that I answered that part, I can't recall what the first part I was supposed to get back and answer.
Well, no, I was wondering if I know a lot of
these calendar stones. Yes, if they're located on travel trails on ancient pathways that people traveled. It's a great question because, of course, the modern paths and the modern tracks that do lead past these, and there are trails that do go past these calendar stones and these compass stones, and some of them are quite remote, and they are accessed today by a network of hiking trails on state land or preserve. But I want to believe that many of these points that have, as I mentioned, many of them are on shoulders. They have or mountain summits that have wonderful view sheds, and I think any place that had a really superior view shed that allow you to survey the land, see who and what's happening, who's coming and who's going from that vantage point was an important spot and was marked as such by these rocks. So I do think they were positioned along travel corridors that humans, as long as there had been humans in the region, utilized to get across the land, and would encounter these, and they would provide assurance and stability that you were in the right place, heading the right way, and oriented in your world correctly.
Well, what about the cairns? Now, they often are in groups. I know when I was looking at in a mountain, there was a huge field there that had cairns all over the place, and you wonder, were these boulders? What do they signify?
Well, that's one of the mysteries in our region, such as the Lewis Hollow site. We've correlated the position of the cairns on the ground with the constellation Draco, which is a significant find. There are other researchers, Evan Pritchard, a Native American scholar of our region, is one of them, who've also discovered other cairn fields that correlate or reflect constellations in the sky. He happens to believe that our whole region, perhaps, is a series of cairn fields that represent constellations. Perhaps all of the constellations in the northern hemisphere could be mapped on the ground as a giant star map. That the evidence for that has not been established, but Evan believes if we keep kind of connecting the dots and discovering these sites and documenting their locations, this pattern might get filled in. And it wouldn't be surprising if that was the case, because I do think they were aware of the major constellations in the northern hemisphere, knew about how they moved across the sky at different times of year and how to interpret that. There was a conference several years ago up at Colgate University called the Stars and Stones Symposium. It was hosted by Anthony Avini. He's America's premier archaeoastronomer, although he's done most of his work in Mesoamerica. He connected with an archaeologist from Fort Drum up in the Adirondacks named Lori Rush, who was the cultural resource manager up there, and she brought to him a calendar site and an effigy site known as the Sitting Bear and Standing Bear, and showed that it was an important archaeoastronomy site, which Avini had no idea there was in his region of New York. When he saw the evidence, he called the symposium. And what was so fascinating is that it wasn't just the scholars and the academics that were involved. It was also the regulators from the state Historic Preservation Office, federal, Department of Interior, the Forest, National Forest Service, and then also he had members of Native American tribes, their elders and their tribal preservation officers attend and share information. And it was held at Colgate, which has a beautiful planetarium, the whole, I believe it's called the Hove Visualization Center, where they were able to host and put a lot of these dates and sky configurations based on the Native American stories and folklore up on the sky, up on the projected on the planetarian ceiling, and it was amazing. And it was the first time that these three groups came together, and it was kind of a watershed moment in research of these ceremonial stone sites, because a lot of these state regulators and visiting academics had to admit that none of this stuff was on their radar, that they had no idea that it existed in our region, that there were archaeoastronomy sites, effigy sites that preserved important information and knowledge, and that held a scientific understanding of how the sky and the objects in it move and interact and help form the belief systems of these ancient cultures. So it was an important day.
Oh, I would imagine. I know that you mentioned effigies, and lots of people probably aren't aware of the stone effigies of which you speak. You want to kind of go into them a little bit? They're fascinating.
Sure. Well, that's one of the great aspects of these piles of stones, is sometimes you look at them and you see things. And one of the things that is found is these turtle cairns, turtle effigies, these beautiful formed piles of stone that you can't really miss that it's a turtle, with a head and paws and the shell built above it. And there are entire sites like in Bearsville. We have the turtle cairns, and there are a dozen or 24 of these beautifully formed cairns that really resemble turtles, and they're all built around a central effigy stone that's about 40 feet across, and maybe 20 feet tall, that also is resembling a giant turtle. So I don't believe that stone was moved. It's natural bedrock, but I think it was identified by ancient culture in the region, and they exploited that stone to express their belief system by building all these other little cairns resembling turtles around it. And then we go to other sites like Spruceton Valley. There are turtle cairns there, and I've had over the course of the years of research I've been doing, people have been sending me pictures from Vermont and from Pennsylvania, from down south, of other turtle effigies. So it shouldn't be that surprising to find a turtle effigy part of a Native American cultural belief system, and expressed in this way, because it's so prominent in their creation myth, the turtle character, and how it was, how North America is considered to be Turtle Island by most Native American nations and tribes. So we do find turtles throughout the Northeast in the woods, and to me it's not that surprising. We also find snakes. Snake and serpent effigies are also quite common, and these usually take the form of a wall. So again, this is a wall that, if you research it and kind of through process of elimination, you can determine, okay, it's not conforming with any property boundaries, so it's not related to surveying. The land wasn't farmed or homesteaded, so it's not necessarily part of farm beautification or agricultural activity. It doesn't enclose anything, so it's not really, something that you could hold livestock in or keep animals out of the crops. So what are you left with? You're left with this curving stone wall that ends at a large boulder. When you look at it a certain way, it resembles a serpent or a snake effigy, and you must consider that it might be something symbolic, something expressing a belief, something that was important for someone or some group to build off in the woods. And when I brought up the archaeoastronomy and having to understand precession and celestial north, and how that position changes due to precession of the equinox, and how ancient cultures may have wanted to keep track of that. To me, in many cases, Draco, or the serpent effigy, is representing Draco, which represents the tracking of the precession of the equinox, and the understanding the changing of the position of the dragon, which is the way many cultures express it in their mythology. The dragon moving, or the dragon unfolding its wings, and this would signify that the position of celestial north was changing. It would change slowly. It would take hundreds or thousands of years for that spot in the sky to get marked by a new star. many generations would go by and there wasn't a star marking a celestial north. So again, this is even more reason for them to be careful in how they would track it, and how when there was a prominent star like Thuban or like Polaris that was marking the position of celestial north, they would note that, they would note the movements, they would encode it in their architecture, in their inscriptions, in their mythologies. Because you have to remember, before the time of the ancient Greeks, there was no scientific or technical terminology. So observations of nature had to be expressed, and were usually expressed through allegory or through symbolism that needs to be interpreted or decoded. So I think all of this important information is there in ancient stories, in ancient law, in pre-literate oral tradition, in pre-Christian mythology that speaks to these cycles of time and death and destruction and resurrection, common themes. So I think this is found throughout the world.
I mean, you look at the Aztecs and the Incas, you look at the Egyptians, you look at so many different ancient cultures, and they all observed the stars. And then you get to the Native Americans, and they as well used it as a calendar, used it as a timetable, used it to, in many ways, they used something that I love. They used geographical calendars. And, if there's a notch in a mountain, and when the sun hits that one notch, it signifies either summer, winter solstice, or the equinoxes. I mean, they used the landscape as a calendar, and something that we wouldn't think to do, normally. And it was amazing. I think you've got a picture in your book of a place that has a notch in a mountain where on the equinox the sun either rises or sets right in that notch, and it is so accurate. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I think those are the Kingston megaliths, and you're absolutely right. And a lot of what I try to document in my book would probably fall into the category of landscape archaeology or landscape astronomy, where they did survey their land and identified these features, natural features in the landscape that they could manipulate and develop into observation sites that would allow them to mark these cycles of time. Because I think, if you think of the way the Earth spins, and every day it makes one rotation and gives us the day and night cycle and how that affects us so profoundly, and it revolves around the sun. It takes a year. It gives us the seasons that affect us, the climate, the weather so profoundly. But then there's that slowest hand on the clock, on the celestial clock, known as precession, known as the Great Year by the ancient Greeks and by the ancient Chinese. And that did involve understanding the position of a celestial north and the changes over time, and how it related to the constellations, both equatorial with the zodiacs and circumpolar with the movement of Draco and the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper, and really understanding how, and this is what the part that's so fascinating to me, because if you think of that slow hand, that slow 26,000 year hand of precession, and you think about how profound the day and the month and the year affect us, well, how does that great year affect us? And according to these the Yugas and the East Indians, it affects us profoundly. It affects the rise and fall of civilization, and it affects the evolution of human consciousness, of technology. Of all of that is tied to this cycle that is associated with celestial powers and celestial energies, and the ebb and flow of our cultures is dependent on it. It's superimposed on evolution. So it's something that's really important for us to understand. The ancients understood it. We're just beginning to kind of rediscover and attach significance to it, because of course we're coming, according to those cycles, coming out of the darkest of times and the lowest and the most shallow of our mental abilities. So we're kind of hung up in a very material time, but slowly progressing towards something that's more of a golden age.
I would hope so, because when it comes to spirituality and level of consciousness and understanding your place in nature, they had it all over us. And I think there is a movement today to get back to understand and to seek out those parts of ourselves that remember those times, and to sort of try to get the familiarity and the connection back. There's a book called Earthing, where they strongly recommend that people walk barefoot on the earth at least 20 minutes a day, because it reattaches them to the earth, the heartbeat of the earth, and the Indians didn't suffer from a lot of the maladies that we suffer from today, because we've isolated ourselves from our connection to the earth. There are so many things that the Indians had to share that have been lost, unfortunately. There was I can't remember the name of the tea. There is a tea that was used by the Native Americans that literally cured cancer, forms of cancer, Essiac tea. And there was a nurse that was treating an Indian who was coming to the clinic to be helped, and this goes back to the 30s, 40s. And she noticed a scar and she said, "What was this from?" And she said, "That's where I was cured from cancer." And the nurse sought out the medicine person that had made the tea for the lady. She cultivated it herself. She made it. She started using it on her patients. She had over 5,000 cures of cancer documented, and the government shut her down. But it was a Native American cure, and it worked. And people still to this day can get the Essiac tea and use it for cancer. I'm not saying it cures all kinds, but it does help people. So they had so much to offer us, and we didn't think to even check out where they were coming from before we decided that they were barbaric and we tried to do away with them. I wanted to talk, too, about the perched boulders, because they're a favorite of mine. And they often look like they should tumble, the minute you touch them. And they are so strongly mounted on their stones that they're sitting on. There are some that are rocking, but for the most part, these huge boulders are sitting on itty-bitty little rocks. And you can't tell me, and we've spoken of this before, that no glacier put it there. And so you wonder, how did they get the boulder on the perch on the rocks? And then what did it symbolize?
Right. Well, we touched on this a little bit, but the perched boulders are really, really fascinating, and there are some that are balanced very precariously. You sent me some really cool pictures the other day of some near the coast, which I wasn't aware of, but they are similar to the ones we have here and the ones I've seen elsewhere. And yes, geologists will tell you that these came out of the glaciers, and as the glaciers receded and their ice melted, they dropped these to the ground, and smaller stones were below the bigger ones in the ice, and some of them just fortuitously kind of settled upon these base stones. And maybe in a few cases that may be the what actually occurred. But in other cases, you can tell that the stone has been manipulated. You can tell that it's at a very unnatural angle, and that nature wouldn't have just placed it that way. And many times they are set up purposefully, like we see in Europe and in dolmens and in megalithic cultures in Great Britain. And many times, as I mentioned, their features are oriented to the cardinal directions, and they're also situated in areas that allow them to be aligned with other large boulders and stones some at great distance, 10 or 20 miles apart. Some like the Hammonasset Line, which may be hundreds of miles, and some of the sites along it are varied. Some might be cairns, some might be perched boulders, some might be chambers, but they all fall along this particular alignment. Some of these that I've documented, I've estimated to be between 20 and 30 tons. A lot of times I do get questions about, well, geez, that's so big, how could humans have moved it? And my answer generally is, well, where there's a will, there's a way. We know that humans have moved huge stones, much bigger than 20 or 30 tons, hundreds of tons, over great distances in antiquity. There's a great story I like to tell about an American engineer who was in China, and he noticed the stones that made up the ramparts on the sides of the Forbidden City. These steps that led up to the central area, or the entrance, huge staircase. But he noticed that on the two ends were these giant recramparts, solid pieces of stone that were just humongous. And this was recently, I would say in the last 10 years, this engineer noticed these, and he started researching them. He was so fascinated. He wanted to know where they came from, how they were transported. And because this wasn't so long ago, I want to say they were, the Forbidden City, I want to believe, was built in the 14th century, maybe the 1300s, somewhere around that period. I could be wrong, but I think that's about the time frame. And he found records. He found records of the construction, and he found a diary that specifically spoke of these stones and where they were quarried from and how they were moved. And it turns out they were moved on what was described in the documents on a river of ice. So from the quarry where they were quarried to the site of the Forbidden City where it was being constructed, they built a road. They drilled wells all along the road. They flooded the roadway. And in January of a particular year, 300 men moving these stones so many feet per day transported them on this river of ice that they created to move these stones. They slid them along on the ice. And what great ingenuity, and who would have thought that would be the method that they would have used to transport these stones. And of course, came the spring, the river of ice, or the road of ice melted away, and perhaps the wells were filled in. Who knows? But he was able to kind of solve that mystery of where these giant stone ramparts came from for the Forbidden City staircase in China, and how they made their way to the construction site. And it was all well documented. So when it comes to moving large stones, I think if people have a will to do it, if they have a civic community approach to let's get this done, and using tools like compound leverage and ropes and fulcrums and good old elbow grease, strength, human strength, they could move these stones. They could get them where they want to. They could transport them. They could orient them to fit their belief system. I don't think that was, anything that was too big a challenge.
That is the most believable story I have ever heard on moving the megaliths.
Yeah, well, you hear a lot of theories about how it was done, but this engineer, I wish I knew his name, was able to, prove how those stones got from where they were to where they went, and the method that was used. So, too bad. I mean, I guess when it comes to the pyramids in Egypt, there are those who claim there are hieroglyphs that show exactly how the slaves dragging the stones, and I'm sure that was part of it. But there were other techniques that are still undiscovered, and that we still don't seem to be able to repeat, even with modern equipment and techniques. Well,
it's obviously, I don't think there were little green men running around helping them. So it was most probably their ingenuity. Like you said, where there's a will, there's a way. You have a problem and you work at it till you solve it. And these people were amazing. And I think most of the roads, at least here in Connecticut, were formed by running a road along the walls that were already in place. Patrick used to say there wasn't a straight road in Connecticut because they, all meander and wind, and that's why we had such a fun time with the stone walls. But I think we should talk too a little bit about the fact that most of them, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them are made of granite, and that's a very hard stone, and I think one of the things about the construction that they used the granite for, to me, the granite it had a great deal of quartz in it. So there's the element of, were some of these structures used for communication in some way?
It's possible. I mean, when you talk about granite, it's made up of quartz, mica, and feldspar. Very, very hard. The quartz and the mica have properties that are piezoelectric. But when it comes to, and of course, quartz crystals are very much part of electronic communication. Remember the old scanners that used to use quartz crystals to allow you to listen to fire and police?
Yep.
And that is just a particular, literally a crystal that's been shaped and formed in a way to allow a particular frequency to resonate through it and be broadcast and transmitted. I don't know that natives or ancient cultures necessarily had the ability to use stones to communicate over great distances. I think that in the case of the research that I did on Malta in the Mediterranean, there were large megalithic structures there that were constructed and configured in such a way that I believe accentuated or amplified sound non-electronically. I think that's a very fascinating subject on non-electrical amplification of sound and transmission of sound. And there are some interesting examples of that, such as yodeling, which was used in the Alps to communicate over great distances using sound. But there was no stone involved. But I guess the best example would be what I know about the temples in Malta and how that was those stone constructions, I believe, were built in a way to allow the human voice to travel great distances, perhaps for cross-water communication, but also potentially as some type of weapon system or way to intimidate or scare your enemy.
You had a wonderful theory explanation for the sirens.
Well, that's what I was leading to exactly.
Okay.
The Malta, the goddesses of Malta, this goddess culture of Malta, which has been documented through many different types of statues and figurines and inscriptions that were found on the island of Malta. And again, the Malta temple culture is pre-literate. It goes back about 1,000 years before Stonehenge or the pyramids of Egypt. And it was a very peaceful agricultural culture, matriarchal in that it was run by these goddess figures, very large Zoptic women, large in stature, large in size, large in weight, and most likely very large in voice. Kind of I guess you would call it stereotypical type of what we think of the opera singer. A large woman with a large voice, although there are plenty of opera singers who are not large that have large voices. But in the so that's why I say stereotypical. But in the Malta culture, I think that the ancient Greeks, who had an ancient mythology, was ancient in their time, which is ancient to us. But the ancient mythologies of the ancient Greeks talked about these different mythological characters, creatures like the sirens, who use their voices, women who use their voices to ward off and even attack their enemies, generally men who are coming to invade. I think that may have been the origin of the siren myths from ancient Greek mythology with the goddess figures of Malta. But there's some I guess circumstantial evidence to support that.
Well, there's a chamber in one of the temples that you have a picture of in the book that has the curved ceiling and the curved walls, and you said that kind of led to the acoustics being able to be accentuated by whatever sound was in them.
Right, that's the oracle chamber in the Hypogeum, an underground temple in Malta that I did some research in 2014, part of the conference on archaeoacoustics, the archaeology of sound, which was held there. And that was really interesting because we got to go into the Hypogeum with microphones and sensitive recording equipment and try different types of apparatus like the human voice, like conch shells, like skin drums and rattles to see how they reacted. And in the oracle chamber, which is this small anteroom to the main temple that has a very interesting carved ceiling that I consider to be a waveguide, because any sound that's created in the oracle chamber is transmitted throughout the Hypogeum, throughout the rest of the temple, which is a 3-story, it's a very large space that they carved out of the limestone, used as a mortuary, a necropolis. They buried their dead there for many, many, many years, but also held ceremonies there. And this oracle chamber seemed to have been built in such a way to, as you say, amplify or accentuate the sounds that were created within it to transmit throughout the temple. So even a whisper that's uttered in the oracle chamber of the Hypogeum, it can be heard in all areas. So it was summarized that a priest or a goddess figure would appear in the oracle chamber and command a ceremony or give out, create sounds that would perhaps create trance-like or induced states of altered consciousness, which would, allow them to do all kinds of things, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, if you go to American Stonehenge, there is a chamber there where there is a voice box almost where someone could be underneath in the chamber and could speak up, and it would broadcast it to the outside world, and so that for want of electricity and microphones, ancient people have learned how to use acoustics. The amphitheaters of the Greeks and the Romans were all constructed so that anybody could hear what was being said because of the way they were formed. So, you have to give credit to these people from antiquity that didn't have all of the techie stuff that we have, and yet they were able to create the same experience. I mean, for heaven's sakes, look at the Colosseum in Rome. They could flip that thing, and have boats in there, and then they had animals in there, and I mean, the cultures that we come from were probably more had a greater sense of ingenious quality to them than we do today, because they didn't have technology to work with. They had the energy of the land and the stones, and just how to create the kind of settings that they needed to have in order to function and take control. And you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say one of the more fascinating aspects of this archaeoacoustic conference were the speakers talking about how wherever the cave drawings and the most ancient rock art was found in these caves in France and around the world, and a lot of times these these works of art were found deep in these caves where there was no natural light, and they were like, well, why would they choose these spots to do these cave paintings where it was so difficult to get to them, and you couldn't even, they had to do them by firelight a lot of time, as it's speculated. But it turns out that where these cave drawings, the greatest concentrations of the cave drawings is where the acoustics and the echoes and the reverberation in that chamber is the strongest. And they've even found that in outside archaeological sites, like in Chaco Canyon, where the highest concentration of petroglyphs are drawn on the walls, is the place where the echoes and the sound is most prominent and most reverberative. in that location. So there's a correlation between the location of the ancient cave paintings and rock art and where the acoustics are the strongest. And I thought, wow, how interesting is that? And to me, it all speaks to kind of the common denominator of all this stuff is attaining states of meditation and altering one state of consciousness to allow you to, communicate with the spirits, have a shamanistic experience, time travel, go through a portal to communicate with the spiritual world. All the above happens when you are in these altered states and in these places where the ancient people created their centers of energy, as you mentioned. These are, focal points or vortexes in some sense.
Well, I have found that, yes, to all of that. But I think what really I kind of am curious about is that in some of the chambers, there's even an energetic charge of a disturbance of a charge. There are anomalies in the entranceways to a lot of the chambers as far as energy goes. Compasses go wacko and things like that.
Right. This is the research by John Burke.
Yes.
What was his book? Stone of Knowledge, Seed of Plenty, something like that.
Yeah.
I might have that backwards. Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty. But anyhow, he showed how, and he had students go out and measure electromagnetic hotspots. Actually, as you mentioned, located at the entrances of these chambers. Sorry, I just had a little interruption here where I'm working.
That's okay.
He measured electromagnetic hotspots, right, associated with the entrances of these chambers. And then he did experiments where he exposed mace, corn seed, to the chambers and left a controlled batch of the seeds in the laboratory. And then after exposing the seeds at the chamber locations where the electromagnetic anomalies were recorded, he grew the seeds, and found that there was a much more robust yield from the mace seeds that had been exposed to the electromagnetic energy. So he proposed that native tribes in their pursuits of agriculture may have taken their mace seeds to these chambers, kind of treated them with the properties of the electromagnetic energies that were present there, and then grown them to achieve greater crop yields than if they had not been treated. So this, to me, was totally kind of mind-blowing. One, that they understood that this was possible, and two, that they were able to identify where these hot spots were, either intuitively or through some type of dowsing or energy location technique. It's really quite interesting. And Burke's work didn't just stop there. He extensively studied the megaliths at Karnak in France, and also identified that the megaliths there had all been stood up and arranged in such a way that their north and south polarities, because every large stone has a north and south polarity. He discovered they were all aligned. They were all set up so that the norths were all in one direction, the souths were all in another direction. And how they would have known that, and how they would have configured that site, and why, is really quite baffling. Although there is some speculation that configuring large stones so their magnetic properties north and south all aligned is somewhat suspiciously similar to what we see in particle accelerators, like the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, Switzerland, where magnets have all been arranged with their north and south polarities aligned so that they could accelerate particles to understand and help discover what they call the God particle. So, is it possible that ancient people were onto the same thing, the same understanding of quantum physics, so that they could set up these stones in Karnak to study those properties. And I think a lot of these places, like the Great Pyramids, like Karnak, like Stonehenge, were what we today might consider great earth science centers, where they studied astronomy and hydrology and seismology, and all the different natural sciences kind of came together in these areas and these locations where they built these giant megalithic constructions, and they were multi-purpose. They didn't just, it wasn't just a tomb. It was not just a compass aligned to the cardinal directions. It wasn't just an energy accumulator, but it was many, many things that together created, a great center of what we would today call science and understanding of the natural world, earth science.
Now, I know that the Native Americans had villages. They had places where they camped constantly. Has there ever been a discovery of what might have been an ancient campsite for a village or something like that?
Well, in our region, certainly. We have areas around Kingston, New York, and Wappingers along the Hudson River. There are areas where there have been continuous human occupation as long as there have been humans in the area. So whether we're talking 12 or 15 or 18,000 years ago when humans arrived here, and some people think it was much longer than that, but that so far the evidence supports that there were humans in, say, the Hudson Valley or the Catskill region, at least 12 and probably more like 15 or 18,000 years ago. And I say at least because it keeps getting pushed back further and further by the academics and by the research that supports what these dates are. But since people first arrived, they did continuously habitate in the Kingston, New York area where you had the Hudson River, plus several other travel corridors like the Rondout Creek, the Esopus Creek, the Wallkill River, all converge and empty into the Hudson River right around the point of Kingston, where Kingston is. And there's a large ridge that runs north and south along the Hudson on the west bank that has been extensively excavated for Native American habitation, industrial lithic production sites, burials, extensively. So if you were to go and research at the New York State Museum or the New York Archives, you would find that there's evidence of continual habitation in these regions because they were a confluence of, or a convergence of travel corridors and a confluence of regional resources, sustainable resources. In the river, you had oysters, you had sturgeon, you had fish of many varieties. In the mountains and woods around the river, you had unlimited game, and you had in the valley floors fertile soil that could be used for agriculture, and all these things were conducted and took place in that region. And there were a few other regions along the Hudson River as well that were continually habitated. So, this speaks to, you can't have an area that's continually habitated by humans for 10,000 years without having a civilization establish itself with all the hallmarks of what typically create a sophisticated system of existence of humans, where they're trading, where they have education centers, where they are, creating art, creating, all the things that you'd expect to find with a great civilization. They may not have had certain hallmarks. They may not have necessarily had to develop a written, a written language, because they were oral in their traditions and they didn't usually have any type of written language. But that didn't necessarily mean that they were not a sophisticated civilization. To me, all it meant is that they had superior memory skills. They didn't have to write things down. They were able to recall and remember everything that was important, including the names of the stars and the movements in the skies.
Well, you mentioned excavate, and two things. I'm wondering, going under the assumption that some of these stone walls could easily be thousands of years old. Has anybody ever excavated to see, and knowing that seasonally there are leaves that fall and they decay and then ground is eventually made and built up, has anybody ever taken one of these really old walls and dug down to see how actually tall it really was?
That's a great question. I don't know that there have been actually any deconstruction of these walls to see how far down they go or how much of the debris has built up along their base. I know there's been some probing with metal rods to see where you stop hitting stone and start hitting soil. I think there are some new science, new techniques that are being developed that are going to finally solve some of the questions as to the dating and the age of these stone sites. You have this technique known as optical luminescence that's able to take soil samples from beneath the walls and from beneath the stone cairns and date them by understanding when sunlight last shone upon the particles of the sample and come up with a date. And I think that's been done on some sites in Pennsylvania through NERA and their research, and I think they're expecting to have some answers by next summer. We're planning to do a optical luminescence study at the Lewis Hollow site, hopefully sometime in 2019, and take samples from both walls and cairns and great cairns, because we have some very large cairns up there up to 100 feet in length and 20 feet in height. And we would very much like to get samples from beneath those. And we're going to be doing coming up in the spring, starting a fundraising to get some of the funds in place to do that study once we determine that that's what we're going to be doing. And I think it is. You have to get permission from the owners. You have to, line up the archaeologists and the laboratory that's going to do the analysis. A lot of that footwork has already been done through NERA, so we're hoping at the Lewis Hollow site and through Overlook Mountain Center, which is the nonprofit that oversees that land, we're going to conduct similar research and hopefully come up with some answers as to how old these piles are, how old these stone walls are, and maybe understand the true origins and antiquity of the site. So it's exciting.
Well, yeah, I know at one point Patrick and I found what we considered to be a very old wall, and he dug down 3 or 4 feet, and it was still going down into the ground. So it would have made that wall 8 or 10 feet high if it was, if all of the dirt was removed to a place where that was, just above the foundation. So a lot of the walls that we see that snake, for want of a better word, across the landscape here in the Northeast, here in Connecticut and probably New York as well, that seem to be, just normal walls. They may not have been just normal walls. They may have been a lot taller than we're seeing, because if they are thousands of years old, there's thousands of years of deposits around them that will have built up. Another
it's
thing
true.
that
It's true it's true with the cairns as well. We may own. Well, I was just saying it's not only the walls, but the cairns as well may have centuries of debris built up on their base, so they may actually, in fact, be quite a bit taller than they visually look, and they may extend down into the ground as far above the ground as we see them. So if you're seeing a wall that's 3 feet tall, it could be easily 3 feet below the ground as well. And there's no way to tell other than to excavate and to kind of deconstruct and to probe and to to dig into it and see. And you're right, a lot that's been limited. Not a lot of that has been done. And possibly for fear that if they are in fact Native American sacred sites or churches, ceremonial sites, you don't want to disturb them, and you don't want to necessarily dig and be invasive. So until the question is settled as to whether a site is colonial, early American, or Native American, it probably is prudent to take caution in how you approach investigating it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the other things that I found fascinating, you were talking about, I don't know if it was hikers or traders or whatever, but they were hiking through an area in the woods, and when they were stopping to rest, their guide went over to a stone pile and selected a rock and put it on the rock. And that was so reminiscent to me of the Jewish tradition of leaving a rock on headstones. And I spoke with you earlier about, the possibility of there being a Jewish influence in some of these procedures.
Well, the burial practice of building a stone mound and leaving a stone when you visit it, I think, is universal. It is certainly a Jewish tradition. And if these are burials, then it is quite possible that they are visited or were visited for many generations, and offerings left in the form of a stone place there. We had a Native American presenter at one of the NERA conferences named Donald Aubrey, who talked about how the natives in the Northeast handled burials, and he did say they were sky burials, not dissimilar to what they would do out west. Out west, they would build a platform. He said in the east, they would put the corpse in a tree and allow it to be defleshed over a period of time by natural processes. And then there was a group of a society known as the bone crushers, who would take the skeleton and crush the bones into powder, basically, and wrap them in an animal skin and bury them in the ground, and then cover it over with a pile of stones. He said the more prominent the person who passed away was, the larger the pile of stones was. So an important chief would have a large pile, and maybe somebody lower down in the tribe, maybe not such a big pile. But this is a universal tradition, and there is a tradition in the Jewish faith of doing this with stones and continuing to do that. As far as ancient Judean presence in America, I don't think it can be entirely dismissed. There's some evidence. There's certainly followers of that belief, such as the Mormons. They certainly believe that the Native Americans are descendants from a Semitic origin, or Semitic tribes, lost tribes of Israel, found their way to America. I'm not convinced entirely of that, but there is some evidence by this researcher, Zena Halpern, that I present in the book, having to do with stones that were found in the Catskills that had Paleo-Hebrew or Phoenician inscriptions on them that referred to this goddess Asherah, a deity in the Bible that's identified as the consort of God. It's almost like the wife of God. Is how she's referred to. And in ancient Judea, about 800 BC, when many cultures were transitioning from matriarchal to patriarchal, men taking charge instead of the women, which in the further back in time you go, the more you find matriarchal cultures and peaceful cultures run by women. And Native American culture is also very much matriarchal, where the women were the kind of the head of the household and controlled a lot of the activities related to the tribe. So there is that parallel. And what Zena believed and what she thought these stones were evidence of were the fleeing or the purging of Asherah followers in Judea around 800 BC, and that they came to America and set up a colony in what today would be the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York. And she has a very fascinating theory and a very interesting book that came out last year. Unfortunately, Zena passed away in the past year, but she did leave a fantastic book, The Templar Mission to the Templar Mission to Oak Island and Beyond, and the Beyond is the Catskills. And she based her research on a document called the Camorra document, found in a church in northern Italy that referred to an overseas expedition in 1178 by an English Knights Templar named Ralph de Soudelay to North America to find these lost scrolls that the Templars had recovered in Jerusalem and had taken to America, or had somehow made their way to America. It's a very complicated, convoluted story. She does a masterful job investigating, doing investigative research. I wouldn't necessarily consider it academic research, but investigative research, yes. And she does a great job connecting the dots of a very complicated story and tying it all together. So yeah, there is the chance that some of this may have actually happened, and that there were colonies of ancient Judeans in America trying to preserve this goddess culture that was being purged from the Middle East at that time, 800 BC. One of the best supporting evidence that Zena came up with was an excavation that took place in the Mediterranean off the coast of Haifa, where they uncovered a ship. This was in the 1980s. They excavated a ship from the floor of the Mediterranean, and when they reconstructed this ship, which had been preserved in an antibiotics it just had been buried in the ocean floor and protected in an oxygen-free environment, is what I'm trying to say, buried in the mud. So it was very well preserved. Okay. When they brought these timbers back up, they reconstructed this ship, and it was much more sophisticated than anything they imagined for the time. Again, this was about 800 BC. This was a trading craft. They believed it. At the time, they thought that most of the ships from that period traveled along the edge of the coast, never really leaving the site of land. But it turned out that when they reconstructed this ship, architecturally it was, very sophisticated. A master sailor would be able to sail this type of ship to any point on the globe without any problem, given the cooperation of the weather gods, of course. But this ship sailed straight across the Mediterranean from Greece to the coast of what today is Israel, and then sunk with its cargo and was preserved until it had been excavated. But probably at least 1,000 years ahead of its time when it came to what they were expecting to find as far as ships, trading ships from that era. So speaks to the possibility that people could have taken such a ship and come to America at that time.
Well, I think we have, really not given credit to antiquity for their ability to do things that sometimes we can't even do today. I think one of the most frustrating things for me about the chambers and the walls and the cairns and the dolmens is that in a lot of ancient sites, they're able to dig up artifacts that help to date, the area or the site. And to my knowledge, there haven't been any artifacts found, at least in the chambers. I don't know about the cairns and the dolmens, but or the walls, but there are no artifacts to lead us to any particular time frame or period. Have there been?
Well, that's one of the biggest challenges, that there is not a lot of that type of artifact evidence. And, of course, the cairns and the stones are not considered evidence themselves, which is a problem. But as far as the cairns, many of them are found in areas where headwaters of streams and springs exist, and there have been arrowheads and spear points and artifacts like that discovered in association with some of the cairn fields. I've seen some myself. I've seen bone tools. I've seen stone artifacts, and even some pottery shards that have been associated with habitations near these cairn sites. But if the cairn sites themselves, and again, this is why they kind of fall between they're not really classified or recognized. One of the reasons by archaeology or anthropology is because of the lack of artifacts. And unless sites are threatened with development and potentially being destroyed, there's really not an opportunity to survey them a proper archaeological survey usually only happens if a site becomes threatened. And there have been many sites that have been threatened that have had archaeological surveys, some of which have turned up artifacts of Native American habitation and others that haven't. And if these are, in fact, ceremonial sites, spiritual sites, I don't know that you would necessarily find the typical type of artifacts that you would find in archaeology that are associated with habitation sites, which is basically piles of debris that they go through, and you know, the garbage that was discarded, the broken arrow points, the remnants of industrial reduction, creating arrow points and spear points. You know, unless that evidence is there, they really can't. They really have difficulty classifying these sites. And when you talk to archaeologists and historians about Native American activity in the Northeast, they're very happy to talk to you about habitation and agriculture, and to some extent industrial lithic production activities. But as soon as you bring up spiritual activities, what were their spiritual practices? They dummy up. They give you very little. They admit to knowing very little, and what you might get them to say is that they practiced a form of shamanism, and that's about it. But they won't really talk about the details, and maybe they don't have the right to. Maybe they don't, you know, hold the keys to talk about the details of Native American spiritual practices, which reminds me of when Spirits of Stone first came out back in April. I gave a talk at the FDR Library, the Presidential Library in Hyde Park, part of the Hudson Valley History Reading Festival. And when I was done with my talk and I was out front and I was meeting people, an older woman came up to me, and she was obviously Native American, and she said she enjoyed my talk, but she took offense to me referring to Native American mythology. She said, you talked about that a lot. And she says, to me, none of it's mythology, it's spirituality. She said, you know, how would you like it if I spoke of Jesus Christ as a mythology? And I said, well, actually, I was raised Jewish, so Jesus Christ is absolutely a mythology. It's not spiritual, but we had a moment there, and we, you know, it begged the question: who owns or who holds the keys to telling these cultural stories of different groups? And really, I think we all do, but it has to be done with, you know, with respect and with sensitivity and with awareness, you know, of all parties. So it's you know, it was kind of a teachable moment for us both. And I think, for me, because now I do refer to it much more as the Native American spirituality, and I don't refer to it as their mythology, because to them it is a spiritual pursuit, was, is, and will be. And referring to it as mythology in some way denigrates or not consciously puts it down, but puts it into a different category. And I think to convey respect, it should be expressed as spiritual beliefs, not mythological beliefs. And I appreciated her correcting me on that.
Well, yeah, I can certainly understand that. I mean, those people, before we interfered with them, had a connection to the land that was profound. And I would say that they had to have people who were either using some form of dowsing rod or who were able to just tune into the energy of the earth to find, they didn't need to find water as much, but find places that had a more spiritual feeling to them. There are, very much like in Europe, there are sites that religious, spiritual sites they're in a line. It's distinctive. It's very much like I'm going to say it wrong, the Hammonasset Line?
Right, the Hammonasset Line, sure. And a lot of that research is similar to some of the work like by Jean Michel in Great Britain, New View over Atlantis, where he showed how so many of the churches are along alignments, straight line alignments, and of course that many of the important churches were built on pre-Christian pagan sites that also recognize the same alignment, and many times aligned with solstice, sunrises and sunsets, and other events, star rises, constellation arises on the horizons. So yeah, there is a correlation between what we're finding in the patterns that we find here in the Northeast and other parts of the world, including megalithic Europe, Great Britain, and those types of alignments that Jean Michel showed in his books.
You want to talk a little bit about the Hammonasset Line, because that's fascinating. It goes from the tip of Long Island through Woodstock.
It does. There's a and beyond. There's a stone out there near Montauk called Council Rock that the Montauk Indians used as a council site, a very large megalith. And I think there's a picture of it in the book. And one of the NERA members, Tom Paul, began researching this. He lives in Hammonasset, so it ended up being called the Hammonasset Line because from his property he traced in both directions towards the megalith on out of Montauk. It's actually at Fort Pond at a cemetery there. And the line is a winter solstice sunrise, summer solstice sunset alignment that goes from basically the tip of Long Island, crosses the Long Island Sound near Plum Island, bisects the Connecticut coast near Hammonasset, and then continues through Connecticut, marked all the way by lithic sites, cairn fields, perched stones, prayer seats, and Manitou stones. Crosses into New York State, crosses the Hudson River at a place called Montgomery Place, a very historic site, and then comes into the Catskills and intersects precisely with what's known as Devil's Tombstone, which is another very large megalith. So when I plotted the location of the Fort Pond Stone, Council Rock, and the Devil's Tombstone up in the Catskills and Stony Clove, and connected those 2 points on the map with a straight line, they were exactly what you would expect to find for a winter solstice sunrise, summer solstice sunset alignment. And then I continued to project that line from the Catskills, and again, as it passes through the Catskills, it intersects with the Overlook Mountain, Lewis Hollow site. It intersects with Stony Clove. It intersects with Spruceton Valley, another important cairn site and wall site. And then there are many other sites that I show in the book that are on alignments that are parallel to the Hammonasset Line. So they have a similar alignment. But when I projected the line further north and west using computer software that accounts for the curvature of the Earth, it led to the copper country up in Michigan and to a little island off the Kennesaw Peninsula called Manitou Island, which again just kind of blew me away, because Manitou, of course, being the spiritual name of Native Americans and the spiritual energy of the Great Spirit. So it was kind of like, well, what's this all about? And how did this come about? And I just raised so many questions, so many fascinating questions that begged an answer. And we really still don't have all the answers to how that line was established and who created all the constructions and what it was pointing to. But of course, in Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, there's that great mystery of the of the copper that's been mined, and the missing copper, and who mined it and when, and that goes into deep antiquity as well, thousands of years BC. And there are those who feel that may have been the source of copper that fueled the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean, with cultures coming over here and mining this high-grade copper that was practically sitting on the ground, on the surface, to be gathered up, and
it's
hundreds
practically
and hundreds
pure
of tons.
too. Yeah.
Yes, very, very high grade.
I'm curious, why did you stop at Manitou Island?
Well, I probably should continue to plot it further.
I mean, the line that goes from American Stonehenge passes right through one of the arches of Stonehenge in Great Britain, and you go beyond that, and it hits another couple of, really important sites. So I would have continued it to see just where else it was going to hit.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that line, because when I saw that on TV, I want to say America Unearthed or something like that, where they interviewed, I think it was Dennis Stone's son, the owner of America's Stonehenge. I tried to recreate that projection using Google Earth, and when I went from the solstice line in America's Stonehenge, it didn't go anywhere near Stonehenge in England. And then, according to what they said, it then, if you continued the projection, I think they said it went to the pyramids in Egypt, or it went somewhere that it would have had to have made a 90-degree turn to end up there. So I hate debunking, but when I tried to recreate what they expressed in that TV show, it didn't add up to my to my senses, and trying to recreate what they described. Now, I did take that same line. Now, that's the summer solstice sunrise, winter solstice sunset line that they claimed ran from America's Stonehenge straight to England's Stonehenge and one of the lintel stones. I couldn't figure that, but when I took the line and ran it in the other direction, from America's Stonehenge south and west, and I think I show this in the book, it ran directly through the chamber locations in Putnam County, and connected several of those locations, and then I continued that projection further south and west to where it bisected what is today the New York-New Jersey border, and it also bisected at that location just between two established sites, one known as the Way on the Calendar Stone, and the other known as Table Rock, one which has a solstice alignment, the other an equinox alignment. So I do think America's Stonehenge is significant. I think the alignments that run from there do point to important things. I wasn't able to recreate what they said ran in the northeast direction, but I did plot it the other way and did find it had some interesting alignments in our region. There's still a lot of clues out there, a lot of things that need to be followed up on. In a way, too much for me to do in one lifetime, but I'm hoping by putting it all into one book and getting it out there for people to see, others will kind of take up the challenge, and I know others are, and I'm not the sole one doing this. You've done a tremendous amount, and you're with your husband also documented a lot of these things, found the same fascination I find, and some of the same patterns. And as I mentioned, Curtis Hoffman in Connecticut and Massachusetts is doing a similar thing. I talk about Harry Holstein down in Alabama, who's identified very similar types of sites down there. He's an archaeologist at the Jacksonville State University. William Romaine out in Ohio is doing a lot of the similar research with mound sites and establishing archaeoastronomy of the Hopewellian and Mississippian Adena cultures. So it is, starting to get more recognized. It is starting to work its way into mainstream academia. It's just a very slow process. The dogma is very entrenched of, a Eurocentric view of how things went here. And, I think maybe 100 years from now, we'll see a different story being taught to the kids. Hopefully it'll maybe only take a few generations, but I think we're on our way. The door has been opened, and now, it's up to the new generation. And that's a big part of this becoming accepted. You now have Native Americans, young scholars who are Native Americans that are archaeologists and anthropologists that work for the tribes, that work for the nations, both in America and in Canada, who are reinterpreting these sites. They're going back and looking at what the archaeologists said in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and correcting them and reinterpreting them as important archaeoastronomy and observation sites when they were dismissed as kind of just random constructions a lot of times just considered ornamental, when in fact there was a very practical purpose to what was being depicted. So we're making progress. I'm glad to say.
Well, yeah, and you've done a tremendous amount of work with Overlook Mountain too, and that is now protected, I understand, or parts of it anyhow.
Well, yes, the Lewis Hollow site, which is a 40-acre site, and another parcel that was connected to it, another 40 acres, we were able to protect about 5 years ago. All this land went up for sale, listed on the MLS, and a lot of people had thought all this land was already protected because the families who owned it had kept it undeveloped for 40 years, but then they were elderly, they needed money, who knows, but it ended up on the market, and we kind of sprung into action, formed Overlook Mountain Center, a nonprofit in New York State, partnered with a foundation who helped come up with the money to purchase the land from the owners, and now it's in the process of being permanently protected, and we are stewarding the land and conducting educational and research programming to help us better understand it and help kind of spread the word about what the site is and teach people, use it as a resource for education, raising awareness of these types of sites. So that's exciting, and we do have programming. If folks go to overlookmountain.org, they can see the schedule of the tours that we conduct there, and they can see some of the results of the studies that we've done, some of the upcoming program. I should mention we do have scheduled for March 16th, which is a Saturday, a program with Doug Harris, a Deputy Tribal Preservation Officer of the Narragansett in Connecticut, and he's going to come and do a program on identifying and protecting ceremonial stone sites. So it'll be a workshop where folks can come and learn about these different types of sites, what they can do, how they can work with local historical societies and town boards to identify and protect these sites if they're threatened, help build a inventory of them in the town so that they can, going forward, be recognized and again, protected should they become threatened. See them as a resource of significant cultural significance, which a lot of times they are not. So that's the kind of work that we're trying to do and bring to the public.
I think it's so important because the walls people just don't even think about. They just figure colonists. The chambers, root cellars, and the dolmens and the cairns as well. I mean, they mark a time that we don't have a history on, and understanding your history is really important because it gives you a foundation to grow on and take notes from, because this culture that we destroyed had a great deal to teach us about the stars, about the land, about how to get along and how to get along with the land and not destroy it, but rather, be a caretaker of it. And I think it's important that children be educated in that way. I'm real close to, Carmel, and I'm real close to all of the chambers, and some of them are so easy to get to. You absolutely want to take children there and show them to them. You want them to understand that this is corbel construction, and the last time it was seen was 3,000 years ago with the Phoenicians, and what were they doing here? And just sort of put seeds of questions in their minds, so that growing up they will learn to look for information that isn't in the books.
That's true. It's such an important message, and these sites do hold a message for us, and that's kind of what's the takeaway that we want to have from visiting these sites, from studying them, I mentioned Doug Harris. If you were to ask him about these sites and what their meaning is, and he's a Native American who has as much insight into these as anyone, and his answer would be very concise. He would say, as you were just mentioning, they're sites, spiritual sites that teach us about balance and harmony, living in balance and harmony with each other, in balance and harmony with nature, in balance and harmony with the universe that encompasses everything around us. And by studying these sites and by realizing their true meaning, we can understand how to achieve that balance and that harmony with nature and within ourselves, which is really what's important, and for us to grow and learn and continue to exist as a society, as a culture. We really do need to find that balance and that harmony that is so missing and so lacking these days, and so much, a part of what we need and don't have. So I try to spend as much time as possible at these sites.
Well, the thing is, it's the spirituality that they had that connected them. And that's something that so many people today have replaced spirituality with technological things. And, it's getting to know yourself and where you are in land. And I live in the woods. I'm on a pond. And it is amazing the symbiotic nature you have when you're really close to the land you're on. It talks to you. And, if you didn't have TV and cell phones and all sorts of other technological things, if we didn't have cars and there wasn't pollution, we would be more in touch and in harmony with the land. So in a way, our becoming more technically related has taken away our connection to nature. It's important to get it back.
It is, and it also speaks to that balance and harmony. We are right now we're struggling between finding that balance between technology and the natural world, and we're in a transitional period where we all grew up with that movie Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. Well, we're living it now. The future is happening quicker than we can assimilate it into our psychological beings. And understanding these sites helps us with that transition, because it helps us realize and put into perspective the balance that we need. We can't just survive and exist on this diet of technology. It's going to starve us, and we need to balance it with nature and with having a relationship with the environment that's productive and positive. And that's going to be the key to us evolving, getting to the next level of human existence, the next rung on the ladder of ascending consciousness, is get into balance with nature, given this onslaught of technology that's in our lives. And hopefully it won't take any kind of cataclysmic or catastrophic event to bring that about, which unfortunately in the histories, these great changes in time and in culture and in society usually portend some type of cataclysmic event that precipitates it. So if we're lucky, we can get through with minor growing pains, just not major destruction, but who knows what the future holds.
Well, on top of that, the Native Americans have a deep respect for the elders, and they rely upon them, and the elders are a very large part of their community. That doesn't happen so much today, and I'm kind of sad to see that, because the elders have the history inside of them. And if they don't share that history, then you're left with an empty space, which is not a good thing. So we are real close to being done here. I have like 400 more questions to ask you, but I do want to thank you so much for being here tonight and helping to share your wealth of information with the audience.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, Barbara. It's been a pleasure. I could, I could spend all night answering your 400 questions, but we'll have to maybe talk again at some point.
Yeah, I want to quickly ask you what happened with the Sophia project.
The Sophia project, yes, at the Center for Symbolic Studies. Sophia is still sitting in a field, awaiting a time when people can erect her, stand her up, and I think she's a victim right now of the times that we're in, because there was a time when putting a stone like Sophia up was probably not a big issue. So this is a large megalith that was identified at the Stone Mountain Farm in Tilson, New York. Steve Larson, who's a wonderful author and researcher, psychologist, therapist, came up with this project probably almost 10 years ago now, and the stone was moved into the field where it's going to be set up. And several years ago, a group of us got together and using large levers and primitive methods, raised it on one end to show that we could, and moved it on rollers. And the goal is to stand this stone up using only ancient methods, but it takes a lot of cooperation. It takes, it's not so much money, it's community spirit, it's building a team, it's coordinating the timing. It's really, a challenge in these days to undertake an effort like this and make it happen. But I don't think it's something that's been given up on. I'm not the lead on that. A gentleman named Rob Roy, who's also a wonderful author and has written a book on stone circles. That he's the lead on that, and I know he hasn't given up. And at some point, we hope to get back into that project. But thanks for mentioning it.
I was fascinated with it, and I went looking for it and realized it hadn't happened yet. But it looks there are pictures on it, and it's amazing. I would love to see that stone raised. But our time is
I think
up.
it will happen.
Our time is up, and I have to say good night. But I do thank you so very much. I have so enjoyed this. I love it when I can talk stones with anybody. And
well, thanks so much for having me, and I hope everybody has a wonderful New Year. And let's keep in touch and we'll talk again.
Absolutely. And to all of you listening, his website is overlookmountain.org. He's got great pictures on there of some of these cairns and walls that are amazing. Take a look at his material. His book is a Bible called Spirits in the Stone: The Secrets of Megalithic America.